All right, so, you've sent over a pretty fascinating mix of articles and reports all about what a second Trump presidency could mean for Canada. And it really does seem like everyone's kind of grappling with the same question, can Canada actually thrive in this potential second Trump era? So let's dive into all this and see what we can uncover.
Yeah, it's a really complex question, and I think the sources you've shared really highlight that complexity in a really interesting way. They paint this picture of this relationship that's obviously deeply intertwined, but also potentially full of tension.
Yeah. And right away, that promise of a 10% tariff on all imports, that kind of jumps out at you. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is predicting some pretty serious fallout from that. They're saying it could end up costing individuals around $1,100 a year.
Yeah, that's a figure that really underscores the potential for economic pain. And it's not just a hypothetical number. If we look at the sectors that are likely to be hit hardest. We're talking about manufacturing, particularly auto parts, agriculture.
Yeah.
These are facing significant challenges. This could lead to job losses in key Canadian industries. There could be ripple effects throughout the entire economy.
But one of the articles you sent actually suggested that maybe this tariff threat could be a bargaining chip for Canada. It could force us to rethink our trade strategies. Do you think there's any weight to that argument?
Yeah, there's definitely, there's a school of thought out there that says this pressure could actually push Canada to diversify its trade partnerships, particularly in Asia. It could also force us to, focus on developing innovative technologies and industries where we already have a competitive advantage. Think, renewable energy or AI.
Hmm.
We might even see Canada taking a more, assertive stance in trade negotiations, leveraging its access to key resources like critical minerals and fresh water.
Okay. Speaking of trade, NAFTA, or I guess it's the USMCA now, seems to be back on the table. Trump has hinted at renegotiations. And, the auto sector, which is so deeply integrated between the two countries, is understandably nervous.
Yeah, the USMCA is a perfect example of just how complex and interconnected our economies really are. And, any substantial changes to the rules of origin, for instance, could disrupt these really intricate supply chains that have developed over decades. I mean, think about all the thousands of parts that go into a single vehicle. Many of those parts cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. Disruptions could mean delays, higher costs, and ultimately price increases for consumers on both sides of the border.
But doesn't Canada's integral role in U.S. manufacturing offer some protection?
It certainly provides leverage, right? I mean, the U.S. relies heavily on Canadian resources and manufacturing capacity, particularly in the auto sector, as we've discussed. It's not easy to just disentangle those supply chains, and that interdependence could act as a buffer against any kind of drastic changes. However,
Hmm.
it's not a foolproof shield, right? I mean, we've already seen how quickly trade tensions can escalate, and there's always that risk that political calculations could override economic realities.
Right. And let's be honest, the political landscape right now doesn't exactly inspire confidence. The relationship between Trudeau and Trump has been, well, let's just say tense.
To put it mildly, yeah. I mean, those G7 clashes were pretty spectacular to watch, and they really highlight a fundamental difference in style and approach, right? Trump's unpredictability and his tendency toward, those kind of aggressive negotiation tactics, they're undoubtedly going to test Canadian diplomacy.
Canada's been talking about this Team Canada strategy to kind of navigate this new terrain. What exactly does that entail, and can it really work with someone like Trump?
Team Canada is basically an all-hands-on-deck approach. It involves really close collaboration between the federal government, the provinces, and the private sector. The idea is to present a united front, leverage all of Canada's strengths, and really build those relationships with key figures in the Trump administration. It has been used before with some success to advocate for Canadian interests on issues like, softwood lumber, for example. However, with a president as unpredictable as Trump, even the most coordinated strategy will require constant adaptation and a willingness to think on our feet.
One thing that really surprised me going through these articles is the suggestion that Trump's immigration crackdown could actually lead to more people heading towards Canada.
Yeah, that's one of the unexpected ripple effects we really have to consider. It's not just about, asylum seekers potentially crossing the border. There's also the possibility of a brain drain. As skilled professionals and entrepreneurs disillusioned with the political climate in the U.S. start looking north for opportunities.
I mean, could this actually shift the demographics of Canada in any noticeable way?
It's a scenario worth exploring, for sure. A significant influx of people, particularly from a country as culturally influential as the U.S., could have, really profound impacts on Canadian society. It could put pressure on housing and social services, spark debates about, cultural identity,
Hmm.
and even influence the political landscape.
Right. And then, of course, there's the recurring issue of defense spending, or rather the lack of it. We've been lagging behind those NATO targets for years now, and Trump has made it clear he expects allies to pull their weight.
Yeah, this is where things could get particularly tricky for Canada. NATO requires members to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, and Canada currently sits at around 1.3%. Trump has repeatedly called out allies who fall short of that target, and his return to office could put immense pressure on Canada to increase its military budget.
Especially considering the economic uncertainties we've already talked about. It's like this political and economic puzzle trying to figure out how to manage all these competing priorities.
Exactly. It's not just about the financial cost of increasing defense spending. It's also about the potential political fallout, right? There's a strong pacifist tradition in Canada, and any move to significantly ramp up military spending is likely to face strong opposition from certain segments of the population. On the other hand, failing to meet those NATO commitments could damage our relationship with the U.S. and other key allies, leaving us vulnerable in an increasingly uncertain world. So this is a dilemma that Canada is really going to have to confront head on.
So we've got this potential economic roller coaster from tariffs, NAFTA hanging in the balance, a potentially frosty political climate with Trump, and this unexpected possibility of increased migration from the U.S. What about the social and cultural aspects you mentioned earlier? How might those be impacted?
Yeah, that's a crucial point, and one that often gets overlooked. The U.S. and Canada, we have this, deeply intertwined cultural relationship. But that doesn't mean it's immune to these political shocks. Trump's policies and rhetoric, particularly on issues like immigration and social justice, have been, they've been deeply divisive. And those divisions, they could spill over into Canada, creating tensions within our own society.
It's almost like we're bracing for impact, but we're not quite sure where the impact is going to land or how severe it's going to be.
Yeah, that's a very apt analogy. We're in uncharted territory here, and the outcome of a second Trump term is far from certain. It's a complex web of interconnected issues, each with its own set of potential risks and opportunities.
Well, we've certainly unpacked a lot in this first part of our deep dive. But before we move on, is there anything we've missed, anything you think our listener should be paying particular attention to as this situation unfolds?
I think one thing that we haven't delved into yet is the potential impact on the environment and climate change policy. This is an area where Canada and the U.S. have historically been pretty closely aligned, but, Trump's skepticism towards climate science and his focus on deregulation, that could create some significant friction.
That's a crucial point, especially given Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement and our own efforts to transition to a greener economy. It seems like, we're heading into a period where Canada might have to actually choose between those economic ties and environmental values.
Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act and one that will require, careful consideration of both the short-term economic consequences and the long-term implications for the planet. It's also an issue where public opinion in Canada is likely to be very engaged and potentially divided.
Yeah.
So this is definitely something we need to explore further in our deep dive.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on in this first part of our deep dive. We've laid out the potential economic, political, and social challenges that a second Trump term could bring for Canada. But we've also highlighted some potential opportunities that might emerge from this shifting landscape.
Yeah, it's a complex and constantly evolving situation. But I think, by understanding the potential risks and rewards, Canada can be better prepared to navigate the challenges and hopefully seize the opportunities that lie ahead.
So we've painted, I think a pretty vivid picture of the potential challenges Canada faces in this, potential second Trump era. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about what Canada can actually do, not just to survive, but to actually thrive in this new reality.
Yeah, that's the crucial question. And I think, the sources you've shared offer some really intriguing clues. And one key area that I think we need to watch is energy. The U.S. is pushing for energy independence, and Canada could play a really crucial role in that. We have vast resources. We're already a major energy supplier to the U.S., and this could be an opportunity to, strengthen those ties and potentially negotiate new agreements that benefit both countries.
That's interesting because, on the surface, it seems like the U.S. wanting to be more energy independent would actually be bad for Canada. But you're suggesting it could actually be an opportunity. How so?
Yeah, it's all about how Canada positions itself.
Right.
Instead of viewing it as a threat, We can frame it as a chance to be a reliable and strategic partner. The U.S. needs a secure and stable source of energy, and Canada can provide that. It's about highlighting our expertise in energy production, our commitment to environmental responsibility, and our shared interest in North American energy security.
So it's about moving beyond that traditional kind of buyer-seller relationship and becoming more of a strategic partner. But what about the specific types of energy? The U.S. seems to be, very focused on oil and gas, while Canada is also investing heavily in renewables. Can we reconcile those different priorities?
Yeah, that's a key challenge, but it's also a potential opportunity. Canada has a chance to showcase its leadership in renewable energy
Yeah.
technologies and demonstrate how we can be a partner in the U.S.'s transition to a cleaner energy future. It's about finding that common ground and promoting those win-win solutions that benefit both economies and the environment. For example, Canada could collaborate with the U.S. on developing, carbon capture and storage technologies or share expertise in areas like, smart grids and energy efficiency. It's about reframing the conversation and highlighting the areas where our interests align.
You mentioned earlier Team Canada could be a valuable tool in navigating a second Trump term. Can you give us some concrete examples of how this strategy might actually play out in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. One example could be, leveraging the Team Canada approach to
Hmm.
secure favorable trade deals in specific sectors. Let's say, for example, the U.S. is looking to source more critical minerals, for its growing electric vehicle industry. Well, Canada has significant reserves of minerals like lithium and cobalt, and we can use that Team Canada approach to coordinate efforts between the federal government, provinces like Ontario and Quebec, and mining companies to present a really compelling case to U.S. investors and manufacturers. It's about, showcasing Canada's strengths, streamlining the regulatory process, and offering a stable and predictable business environment.
So it's about being proactive and strategic rather than just reacting to whatever the U.S. throws at us.
Exactly. It's about anticipating needs, identifying opportunities, and putting forward those solutions
Yeah.
that benefit both sides. It's also about building those relationships with key players in the Trump administration, Congress, and the U.S. business community. And this requires a coordinated effort that involves not just government officials, but also business leaders, academics, and even cultural figures who can act as ambassadors for Canada.
This all sounds very strategic and, well coordinated, but what about the Canadian public? What role do everyday Canadians play in all of this?
That's a crucial question. Ultimately, the success of any strategy really depends on the support and engagement of the Canadian people, right?
Mm.
Canadians need to be aware of the potential impacts of a second Trump term and engage in thoughtful discussions about how to respond. This includes being mindful of the different perspectives and viewpoints within Canada and understanding that there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution.
So it's about being, informed and engaged citizens, not just passive bystanders.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that this isn't just about, politics or international relations. This is about the future of Canada, and everyone has a stake in it. By being informed, engaged, and willing to participate in, constructive dialogue, Canadians can help shape the country's response to this new reality.
We've talked about, economic strategies and political maneuvering, but what about the social and cultural aspects of the relationship? Could those be impacted as well?
Absolutely. The U.S. and Canada share a very close cultural relationship, but that relationship could be tested, I think, under a second Trump term. Trump's rhetoric and policies, they've often been, divisive and polarizing, and that could spill over into the Canada-U.S. relationship, creating tensions and divisions within Canadian society.
In what way? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. One area where we might see tension is immigration. Canada has a long tradition of, welcoming immigrants and refugees, while Trump has taken a much more restrictive approach. This difference in values could lead to, disagreements over border security, asylum policies, and even the treatment of immigrants within Canada.
You're talking about issues like the Safe Third Country Agreement, which has already been a point of contention between the two countries.
Exactly. And with a second Trump administration, we could see renewed pressure on Canada to tighten its border controls and adopt a more restrictive approach to immigration. This would be a difficult balancing act for Canada as we try to maintain our humanitarian commitments while also, managing our relationship with a key ally.
Beyond immigration, are there other areas where we might see these cultural clashes?
Social justice is another potential flashpoint. Canada has made significant strides in recent years in promoting, LGBTQ plus rights, gender equality, and racial justice. Trump, on the other hand, has often aligned himself with groups that oppose those advancements. And this could lead to disagreements over issues like, same-sex marriage, abortion rights, affirmative action. These disagreements could manifest in diplomatic tensions, economic boycotts, and even, protests and demonstrations on both sides of the border.
So it's not just about managing, government to government relations. It's also about navigating that potential for social and cultural friction between the two populations.
Precisely. And it's important for Canadians to be aware of these potential challenges and to engage in, respectful dialogue, even when there are disagreements.
Hmm.
We need to remember that the Canada-U.S. relationship is about more than just economics or politics,
Yeah.
right? It's about people. And it's important to nurture that relationship even when times are tough.
You mentioned that Trump's environmental policies could clash with Canada's. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
One of the most significant points of divergence is climate change, right? Canada has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Agreement, while Trump has, withdrawn the U.S. from the accord and rolled back many environmental regulations. So this difference in approach could have several implications for Canada.
What are some things that could come up?
Well, firstly, it could create some economic tensions. As Canada implements, carbon pricing and other measures to reduce emissions, it could put Canadian businesses at a competitive disadvantage compared to their U.S. counterparts who face, fewer regulations. This could lead to calls for protectionist measures or even, retaliatory tariffs from the U.S.
That's a real concern, especially given how, interconnected our economies are.
Exactly. And it's not just about trade. Trump's focus on deregulation could also have, environmental consequences for Canada. For example, looser environmental standards in the U.S. could lead to, increased pollution that crosses the border, affecting air and water quality in Canada.
So it's not just about the political rhetoric. There are real, tangible consequences that could impact Canadians' lives.
Absolutely. And it's important for Canadians to be aware of these potential risks and to hold their elected officials accountable for protecting Canada's interests, both economic and environmental.
So it sounds like Canada is facing this real dilemma, trying to maintain those close economic ties with the U.S. while also upholding its own environmental values.
It's a delicate balancing act, and there are no easy answers. Canada will need to be strategic in its approach, finding ways to, collaborate with the U.S. on areas of common interest, while also standing firm on its own principles.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored potential opportunities in areas like, energy and trade, but we've also highlighted the significant challenges posed by Trump's policies on immigration, social justice, and the environment. It seems like Canada will really need to be, very agile and adaptable to navigate this complex landscape.
Absolutely. And it's not just about reacting to whatever the U.S. does. It's about being proactive,
Hmm.
setting our own priorities, and finding ways to advance our interests, even in a challenging environment.
Okay, so, we spent a good chunk of time unpacking these potential opportunities and challenges for Canada in a second Trump term, but it feels like it all kind of hinges on what Trump actually does. I feel like we're kind of in this holding pattern, just waiting to see what happens. So is there anything Canada can do to be more proactive rather than just reactive?
Oh, there's always room for proactive maneuvering, even when there are a lot of unknowns. One thing Canada can do is really double down on building relationships with those who share our values, but within the U.S. I'm talking state governments, city leaders, businesses,
Yeah.
even cultural figures.
It's like creating this network of allies who can champion Canadian interests, even if things at the federal level get a little tricky.
Precisely. And this isn't just theoretical. This kind of cross-border collaboration is already happening. I mean, you've
Mhm.
probably seen news about Quebec and California linking their carbon markets, right? Or Canadian provinces working with U.S. states on those electric vehicle charging corridors. That's the kind of groundwork that can really pay off, no matter who's sitting in the Oval Office.
So it's like we're diversifying our U.S. strategy, beyond just focusing on Washington, D.C. But what about those big ticket items we discussed earlier? Trade, defense spending. Those feel like they're inevitably going to be those, top-down negotiations.
They are. But even there, preparation is absolutely key. On trade, for example, Canada can start by really meticulously analyzing the USMCA, identifying those potential pressure points,
Mhm.
and then crafting counterproposals that could actually benefit both sides. Think win-win scenarios, not just digging in our heels.
So it's almost like being that chess player who's already thought 5 moves ahead, anticipating what the other side might do.
Exactly. And on defense spending, while that 2% of GDP target, that is a NATO commitment, it's not something Trump just invented, but his pressure does make it feel more urgent. So Canada kind of has a choice here. Either meet that target and potentially face, domestic pushback, or we develop a really strong case for why our contributions go beyond just dollars and cents, right? Think Arctic security, peacekeeping expertise, things that resonate with American interests too.
That all makes sense from this high-level perspective, but I'm curious about, the average Canadian listening to this right now. What can they do besides just, feeling anxious when they read the news?
Well, that's where informed action comes in.
Mhm.
First off, don't just consume headlines, right? Dig a little deeper. Look at the analysis. Look at the different viewpoints that are out there. The more you understand those nuances, the less likely you are to be swayed by, fear-mongering or sensationalism.
So be a discerning news consumer, not just passively absorbing whatever's thrown at you.
Precisely. Second, support Canadian businesses whenever you can. A strong domestic economy, that makes us a lot more resilient to those external shocks. And finally, don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Engage with your elected officials. Join organizations that are working on issues that you care about. Make your perspective heard within the Canadian conversation.
It's a good reminder that, even in this globalized world, those individual actions still really do matter. We're not just along for the ride.
Exactly. And here's a final thought for you, and this isn't explicitly in the sources, but it kind of builds on what we've been talking about. No matter how the next 4 years go, I think this period is going to force Canada to define its identity on the world stage, maybe even more clearly than before. Are we simply America's sidekick? Or are we a nation with our own distinct values and our own role to play? And that introspection, I believe, is ultimately a positive thing.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. It's not just about, weathering the storm, but using it as a catalyst for growth. Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up?
A second Trump term, it's undoubtedly a significant event for Canada. But it's not the only factor shaping our future, right? So stay curious, stay engaged, and remember that Canada has weathered plenty of storms before. We'll find a way to navigate this one too.
Well said. And on that note of cautious optimism, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really fascinating exploration, and we hope you'll join us again for our next adventure into the world of knowledge